If someone had told me a year ago that the man who haunted my window view would end up sleeping in my bed, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, papery sound I reserve for things that were fundamentally impossible, like spontaneous human combustion or winning the lottery. My life was a series of carefully stacked books, alphabetized and cross-referenced, with no room for a chaotic, beautiful, and utterly terrifying plot twist. And Julian was nothing if not a plot twist. My world was contained within the four walls of my third-floor apartment and the hushed corridors of the university archive where I worked. It was a quiet world, a predictable one. I liked it that way. My routine was a fortress against the noise of the city, against the messy unpredictability of other people. I woke at 6:30, made coffee in a French press, read for an hour, and then walked the 12 blocks to the archive. I came home at 5, made a simple dinner, and spent my evenings cataloging my own collection of historical maps or losing myself in a novel. The only disruption, the only variable in my carefully calibrated equation, was him. His name was Julian. I only knew that because I'd seen it stenciled on the side of the construction company's truck. For 6 months, he and his crew had been gutting the old brick warehouse across the street, transforming it into expensive lofts. From my reading chair by the window, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of their progress. Of his progress. He was a presence. That was the only word for it. Even from across the street, he seemed to take up more space than other people. Broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that was always messy with sweat and sawdust. He moved with a kind of deliberate physical confidence that a man whose primary form of exercise was turning fragile manuscript pages, found both intimidating and utterly mesmerizing. He was the foreman, the boss. He didn't shout, not like the others. His authority was quieter, more absolute. A pointed finger, a low word I couldn't hear, and things happened. Beams were lifted, walls came down, windows were set into place. He worked as hard as any of them, his t-shirts perpetually stained with grime, his arms corded with muscle that spoke of real labor, not the curated kind you saw in gyms. I watched him. It became a part of my routine, an unspoken ritual. My morning coffee was accompanied by the sight of him directing a crane. My evening reading was punctuated by the glow of his work light, as he often stayed late, long after his crew had gone home, walking the skeletal floors of the new building alone. Our distance was absolute. A street, 3 floors of air, and a lifetime of difference. He was loud, physical, and real. I was quiet, cerebral, and hidden. He built things with his hands. I preserved things that were already crumbling. He probably drank beer with friends after work, laughing loudly in crowded bars. I drank tea and considered a second person in my apartment a crowd. We were different species, occupying separate, non-intersecting ecosystems. And yet, I felt this strange one-sided connection. A pull. I noticed the way he'd sometimes stop and stare up at the sky, his face unreadable. I noticed the slight limp he had when he was tired at the end of a long day. I noticed the tattoo of a compass rose that peeked from the collar of his shirt when he bent over. I was an archivist, after all. I collected details. And Julian had become my most fascinating, uncatalogued artifact. The night it all changed started like any other. It was late, past 11, and a hard autumn rain was lashing against my windows. I was in my chair, a book open in my lap, but I was mostly watching the single light burning in the warehouse opposite. His light. He was still there. I wondered what kept him so late. I wondered if he was lonely. My building was old, a grand dame with good bones, but tired plumbing. I'd grown used to her groans and sighs. But this sound was new. A violent, percussive shudder from deep within the walls, followed by a low, insistent groan that was not the wind. I set my book down, a tremor of unease, cold and sharp. Then I heard the water. It wasn't a drip. It was a roar, a cascade. It sounded like a waterfall had suddenly erupted in my hallway. I scrambled to my feet, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. I threw open my apartment door and stared into a nightmare. Water was pouring from the ceiling, gushing down the stairwell, pooling on the worn tiles. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and rot. Panic seized me. My books, my maps, my quiet, ordered world was being washed away. I slammed the door and ran to my study, my hands shaking as I started pulling my most precious items off the lower shelves. The water was already seeping under my door, a dark, spreading stain on the hardwood. I was so consumed by my frantic, useless effort that I didn't hear the pounding on my door until it was right in my ear. It was a heavy, solid sound, a fist against wood. "Anyone in there?" "Hello." The voice was deep, resonant, and utterly unfamiliar within the context of my own home. It cut through my panic like a ship's horn through fog. I stumbled to the door, my socks now soaked, and wrenched it open. And there he was, Julian, standing in my hallway, drenched from the rain and the overflowing water, his face grim. The single bare bulb of the corridor light cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look like something carved from stone. He was bigger up close, so much bigger. The space between us, once a city street, had collapsed to a few feet of sodden carpet. "You need to get out," he said. His voice was calm, authoritative, the same voice he used to direct his crew. Main pipe on the roof burst. Whole buildings flooding. I just stare, my mind a blank slate. All the details I had collected from afar coalesced into a staggering, overwhelming reality. The scar along his jaw was a thin, white line. His eyes were a dark, serious brown, not black as I'd imagined. He smelled of rain and wet concrete and sawdust. "My books," I stammered, the words feeling clumsy and stupid in my mouth. He glanced past me into my apartment, his eyes taking in the shelves, the stacks of paper, the general, organized chaos of my life. For a second, his expression softened, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Understanding, maybe. "Okay," he said, and then he was moving past me, into my space, into my world. "Okay, where are the most important ones? We'll move them. The fire department is on their way, but we have a few minutes," and just like that, the barrier was gone. He was here. He was in my apartment, water pooling around his heavy work boots, and he was telling me what to do. My fortress had been breached, not by an enemy, but by an impossible, terrifying rescue. The carefully built wall between my world and his had just been washed away. I pointed, numbly, toward my small study. In there, the flat files. The maps, he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He strode into the room, his presence filling the small space, dwarfing my desk, my carefully arranged life. He looked at the antique wooden map cabinet, then back at me. "This thing heavy." "Very," I breathed. "Right. You take that end." We moved in a strange, silent tandem. My world, usually governed by quiet contemplation, was now a scene of frantic, physical exertion. We lifted boxes, stacked priceless leather-bound volumes on top of my kitchen table, the highest and driest point in the apartment. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch, lifting things I would have struggled with as if they were nothing. I watched his hands. They were calloused and stained, the nails cut short. Hands that knew how to build, how to hold, how to fix things. They were a world away from my own hands, which were pale and soft from a life spent with paper and ink. We worked against the soundtrack of the building groaning and the water rushing. The power flickered, then died, plunging us into near darkness, lit only by the faint, diffused glow of the streetlights through the rain-streaked window. "Damn it," he muttered. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his pocket. The beam cut a sharp cone through the gloom. "Keep going." In the focused beam of that light, our world shrank. It became just the two of us, the smell of wet paper and the looming threat of the rising water. I felt a bizarre sense of calm settle over me. The worst had happened, and I was not alone. The solitary captain was no longer the only one on his sinking ship. We were moving a heavy box of cartography journals when it happened. The box was awkward, unbalanced. My grip slipped on the damp cardboard. As I fumbled to regain my hold, my hand slid sideways, brushing against his. It was nothing, an accident, a fleeting contact of skin on skin. But it felt like a jolt of electricity, a sudden, searing heat that shot up my arm and straight to my chest. His skin was rough, warm, and real. So incredibly real. I flinched back as if burned. The box tilted precariously. "Easy," he said, his voice low. He easily compensated for my mistake, hoisting the box into his arms alone. I got it, he said on the table, and turned back to me, the flashlight beam catching my face. I couldn't hide the shock in my eyes. My heart was hammering a wild, panicked rhythm against my ribs. It was just a touch, my rational mind screamed. But it wasn't. It was the first time. The first breach of that final, most intimate distance. His gaze held mine for a moment too long. The air thickened, suddenly charged with something other than the smell of rain and disaster. I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a question. Or maybe I was just projecting my own internal chaos onto him. My breath caught in my throat. He knows. He felt it too. The thought was terrifying. Then he blinked, and the moment was gone. We should get the rest of these, he said, turning away. The spell was broken. I stood there for a second, my hand tingling, my entire body humming with a strange, new frequency. I was a finely tuned instrument that had just been struck for the first time. The shock of it, the pure, resonant vibration, left me stunned and shaking in the dark. He worked with a grim focus after that, and I followed his lead, my mind a whirlwind. I kept replaying the touch, the brief, accidental intimacy. In my memory, it slowed down, expanded. I could feel the rasp of his calluses against my palm, the solid strength beneath. It was a language my body understood, even if my mind was reeling. In the focused beam of his flashlight, I noticed new things about him. The exhaustion etched around his eyes, deeper than I'd ever seen from my window. A faint tracery of silver in the dark hair at his temples. The way his jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching with tension. The confident foreman, the master of his domain, was just a tired man in a flooded building. He was vulnerable. The realization struck me with surprising force. We had moved the last of the salvageable items when the firefighters finally arrived, their heavy boots thumping up the stairs, their voices echoing in the ruined hallway. They took over with professional efficiency, shining powerful beams into the darkness, shouting instructions. Julian stepped back, suddenly just another bystander. He ran a hand through his wet hair, looking around at my ravaged apartment, at the books piled high on my table. They'll have to shut off the power for a while, he said, his voice quiet now, almost lost in the commotion. And the water. You can't stay here tonight. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Of course. My sanctuary was gone. My routine was shattered. I had nowhere to go. My carefully ordered life had dissolved into a puddle on the floor. I don't know. I started, the panic rising again, cold and slick. I had no family in the city. My colleagues were acquaintances, not friends you call in the middle of the night. My solitude, once a comfort, was now a cage. He was watching me, his expression unreadable in the flashing emergency lights that now pulsed through the window. He seemed to be wrestling with a thought. Listen, he said, his voice hesitant for the first time. The place across the street, my place. It's not finished, but it's dry, and it has a couch. Power's on a separate grid. I stared at him. The offer was so unexpected, so impossible, that my brain couldn't process it. Go with him to his apartment? The place I had only ever seen from a distance? It was a leap across the chasm that had always separated us. You don't have to, he added quickly, as if sensing my hesitation. It's there. Better than a shelter. My anxiety was a physical weight, a cold stone in my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to decline, to retreat into what was left of my shell. But then I looked at my flooded home, at the ruins of my quiet life, and I looked at him, at this man who had appeared out of the storm like some kind of reluctant savior. He was offering a hand, and for the first time in a very long time, I was desperate enough to take it. Okay, I heard myself say, the word a thin thread of sound. Thank you, a flicker of relief, or maybe surprise, crossed his face. Right, grab a change of clothes. Whatever you need for the night. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, stuffing a few things into a bag, my movements numb and automatic. The whole time, I was acutely aware of him waiting by the door, a silent, solid presence in the wreckage of my life. He had crossed the street. He had crossed my threshold. And now, I was about to cross his. The world had tilted on its axis, and I had no idea which way was up anymore. The journey across the street felt monumental, a crossing of some great, symbolic river. The rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. The air was cold and smelled of wet asphalt. Julian walked beside me, not speaking, the silence between us stretching thin and taut. I was clutching the strap of my overnight bag like a lifeline. My heart was a frantic, wild thing, beating a rhythm of pure adrenaline and fear. What was I doing? He led me through a side door of the warehouse, into a cavernous, dark space that smelled of sawdust, paint, and drying concrete. The acoustics were strange. Every footstep echoed. He hit a switch, and a string of bare work bulbs flickered on, casting a harsh, yellow light over stacks of drywall and coiled cables. This was his world, the place I had only ever seen from the outside. Being inside, it felt like a transgression. He took me up a wide, industrial staircase to the top floor. His apartment. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. "It's a mess," he warned. Still a work in progress. He wasn't exaggerating. The space was huge, with massive windows that looked out over the city, and directly in my own darkened, wounded building. The floors were bare plywood. The walls were patched with plaster, and wires dangled from the ceiling where light fixtures would eventually go. But in the center of the room was a worn leather couch, a coffee table made from an old shipping crate, and a small, makeshift kitchen area. It was a campsite in the middle of a construction zone. "The bedroom and bathroom are mostly done," he said, gesturing down a short hall. "Plumbing works, at least. You can take the bed. I'll take the couch." "No, I can't." I started, the protest automatic. "You can." He cut me off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've had a rough night." He walked over to the makeshift kitchen and filled a kettle from a plastic water jug. "Coffee? Or something stronger?" "I think I have whiskey. Coffee would be—" "Coffee is good." "Thank you." My voice sounded small in the vast, echoing space. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder. This was his sanctuary, his private space, and it was nothing like I would have imagined. It was raw, unfinished, a state of becoming. Just like the man himself, I supposed. Full of potential, but still under construction. He handed me a steaming mug. Our fingers brushed again as I took it. This time, I didn't flinch. The heat was still there, a low, steady hum, but the shock was gone, replaced by a strange, unnerving warmth. I wrapped my cold hands around the mug, anchoring myself to its solid presence. He leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping his own coffee, his eyes on the city lights beyond the huge window. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of my apartment. It was a shared silence, filled with the unspoken events of the night. "I saw you sometimes," he said, his voice quiet, startling me. He didn't look at me. He kept his gaze fixed on a view. From the scaffolding. "Sitting in your window, reading." My blood ran cold. He had seen me. All those times I thought I was an invisible observer. I had been observed myself. The archivist had been archived. My face flushed with a hot, terrible shame. He must think I was some kind of creep, a lonely weirdo staring at him all day. I didn't mean to stare. I mumbled into my coffee mug. "Your window is just right there." It was a pathetic excuse. He turned his head then, and his eyes met mine. There was no judgment in them, only a tired sort of curiosity. "I used to wonder what you were thinking," he said. "You always looked so serious. Like you were judging my joinery from 3 stories up." A small, unexpected laugh escaped me. It was a rusty and used sound. "I don't know the first thing about joinery," I admitted. "I was probably just wondering if you were ever going to go home." He gave a short, humorless huff. "Yeah, me too." He looked away again, back at the rain-slick street. "This project, it's been a beast. Poured everything I have into it. My money, my time." He paused. "Pretty much everything else, too." There it was again. A crack in the facade. A glimpse of the man behind the confident foreman. The loneliness I had projected onto him from my window wasn't a fiction. It was real. I could feel it in the cavernous, empty space around us. The storm, which had been a quiet drizzle, chose that moment to return with a vengeance. The wind howled, rattling the huge, uncaulked windows in their frames. A furious volley of rain hammered against the glass, and a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. I jumped, sloshing coffee onto my hand. The lights flickered violently, then went out, plunging us into absolute blackness. Son of a... Julian's voice was a low curse in the dark. Another flash of lightning illuminated his shape, a dark silhouette against the window. The thunder rolled again, a long, deep growl. The raw, elemental power of the storm outside was suddenly inside with us, stripping away the last vestiges of normalcy. We were two strangers in a dark, unfinished room, cut off from the world. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against the base of the thunder. I could hear him moving, the scuff of his boots on the plywood floor. "Stay put," he said, his voice closer now. "I have more flashlights." I didn't move. I could barely breathe. The darkness was total, disorienting. It was a primal, sensory deprivation. All I had was the sound of the storm, the smell of his coffee, and the overwhelming, unseen presence of him somewhere nearby. A small, powerful beam suddenly cut through the blackness, not on me, but aimed at the floor. He had found one. He walked back towards the counter, the light bobbing with his steps. "Power grid must be overloaded," he said, his voice trying for casual but failing. The storm was too loud, the darkness too complete. He found a second, bigger flashlight and set it on the counter, aiming it at the ceiling. It filled the room with a diffuse, indirect glow. We were back in a world of shadows and half-light, even more intimate than before. He stood there, not looking at me, his back to the counter. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated by the roar of the wind. All the pretense was gone. All the roles we played, the quiet observer, the confident builder, had been washed away by the flood and blown away by the storm. We were just two men. "I wasn't judging your joinery," I said, the words coming out of me before I could stop them. My voice was quiet, but it seemed to fill the entire space. He turned his head slowly. No, I took a breath. The truth felt like a dangerous, fragile thing. I don't know, curious. You seemed solid, real. You were building something, and I just watched things fall apart. The admission hung in the air between us. It was the truest thing I'd said to anyone in years. He looked at me, really looked at me for a long time. His eyes were dark pools in the dim light, and I felt like he could see everything. All my loneliness, all my fear, all the pathetic, secret longing I had harbored for months. "Nothing about this feels real," he said, his voice a low rasp. "My whole life is just try to hold things together with nails and screws. Try to make something that won't fall down." He took a step towards me, then another. "But it's all just empty rooms." He stopped just a few feet away. The space between us was electric, a live wire. I could feel the heat coming off him. My own body was a mess of contradictions, frozen in place but burning from the inside out. My mind was screaming danger, retreat, but my feet were rooted to the floor. "You're not an empty room," I whispered. The words were for me as much as for him. He let out a shaky breath. "Neither are you," he said. "Your place, it's not just books. It's a life, a whole world in there." He took the final step, closing the distance between us. He was so close now, I could see the flicker of the flashlight reflected in his eyes. He lifted a hand, slowly, hesitantly, as if he was afraid I might bolt. He didn't touch me. He just held it in the space between us. "I don't know what's happening," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "I just know that for months, I'd look up from my work, and I'd see your light on. And I'd feel less alone." The confession hit me like a physical blow. It was the mirror image of my own secret. My one-sided observation had been a conversation all along, and I never knew it. My carefully constructed world, already flooded and broken, shattered into a million pieces. All the reasons, all the distances, all the impossibilities, they all just evaporated. There was only him, here, now, telling me a truth that matched my own. I closed my eyes. I couldn't bear the intensity of his gaze. And then I felt it. the hesitant touch of his fingers against my cheek. His hand was rough, callous, just as I knew it would be, but the touch was incredibly gentle. A question. I leaned into his hand, a small, involuntary movement. An answer. He made a sound, a low groan deep in his chest. His other hand came up to cup the other side of my face. He held my head as if it were something precious and fragile. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss like in the movies. It was slow, hesitant. It was searching. His lips were chapped from the wind, and they were unbelievably soft. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and rain and a loneliness so profound it broke my heart. It was the most honest thing I had ever felt. I brought my hands up to his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart under my palms. It was racing as fast as my own. I wasn't the only one who was terrified. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. We were both breathing heavily, our breath mingling in the cold air. "Leo," he whispered, and the sound of my own name on his lips was both a shock and a homecoming. I hadn't realized he knew it. Of course, he must have seen it on my mailbox. "Julian," I breathed back. And then he kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation. This time it was a release, a dam breaking. All the months of watching, of wondering, of unspoken longing poured into that single point of contact. It was a kiss of recognition, of finding a missing piece of yourself in the most unlikely person imaginable. The storm raged outside, but in here, in the circle of his arms, I had found the quiet eye, the center of everything. The morning came in shades of gray. A pale, watery light filtered through the massive, dirty windows, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air. The storm had passed. The silence it left behind was absolute, profound. I woke up slowly, tangled in unfamiliar sheets that smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and soap and something uniquely Julian. For a moment, I was adrift, unsure of where I was. Then the memories of the night came rushing back. The flood, the rescue, the confession, the kiss. My eyes snapped open. I was in his bed, alone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through the warm haze of sleep. I sat up, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm. The bedroom was sparse, furnished with only the bed and a single wooden chair piled with clothes. The door was slightly ajar. "Julian," I called out, my voice a rough croak. Silence. A terrible, crushing silence that was heavier than the one I had cultivated in my own apartment. My silence was a choice, a comfort. This was an absence. I pushed the blankets off and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My clothes from the night before were folded neatly on the chair. I dressed quickly, my fingers fumbling with the buttons on my shirt. My whole body felt brittle like glass. I walked out into the main living area. The space was empty. The coffee mugs from last night were washed and sitting on the counter. The flashlights were gone. The only evidence that he had been here at all was a single, folded piece of paper on the shipping crate coffee table. My stomach plummeted. A note. He had left a note. People don't leave notes for good things. My feet felt like lead as I crossed the plywood floor. My hand was shaking as I reached for it. It was a piece of paper torn from a legal pad, the writing a rough, masculine scrawl. Had to get to the site early. Supplies delivery. Help yourself to coffee. Jay, that was it. No. I had a great time. No. Let's talk later. No acknowledgement of the earth-shattering, life-altering thing that had happened between us. Just a logistical, impersonal message. Help yourself to coffee. The cold dread in my chest solidified into a block of ice. I sank onto the edge of the couch, the note clutched in my hand. My mind, my greatest asset and my cruelest enemy, began to spin. It constructed a brutal narrative with terrifying speed. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. He was drunk, or tired, or caught up in the drama of the storm. He wasn't like me. He was a normal guy. He had probably woken up this morning in a cold sweat of horror at what he'd done. With me, the quiet, strange man from the window. He had fled. He couldn't even face me. He'd left a coward's note and run. Every insecurity I had ever harbored rose up and screamed in my ear. I was too quiet, too awkward, too old, too much. I had misread everything. The vulnerability I thought I saw in him was just a projection of my own desperate loneliness. The kiss that had felt like a moment of pure, honest connection was just a mistake. A moment of temporary insanity. I felt sick. A wave of shame so profound it made me want to curl up and disappear washed over me. I had let him in, not just into my apartment, but into my carefully guarded inner world. I had let myself feel something, hope for something for the first time in a decade. And this was the result. An empty room and a dismissive note. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a punishment. A confirmation of my own unlovability. I had been right all along. It was safer to be alone. It was smarter. It hurt less. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be in his space, breathing his air, surrounded by the ghost of what I had foolishly thought we'd shared. I needed to go back to my own territory, to my broken fortress. I stood up, leaving the note on the table. I didn't make coffee. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the apartment, not bothering to close the door firmly behind me. I walked down the industrial stairs and out into the pale morning light. The street was littered with wet leaves and debris from the storm. My building looked sad and wounded. There was yellow tape across the main entrance. A notice from the city was plastered on the door, declaring it temporarily uninhabitable. It didn't matter. I ducked under the tape and went inside. My apartment was a disaster. The water had receded, but it had left behind a trail of destruction. The wood floors were warped, a thin layer of silted grime covered everything, and the air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of mildew. But it was mine. I walked into the middle of the living room and just stood there, surrounded by the wreckage. It was a perfect metaphor for how I felt inside. Ruined, waterlogged, uninhabitable. The absence of him was a physical presence. I could still see him standing by the window, could still feel the phantom touch of his hand on my cheek. The memory was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. I spent the rest of the day in a numb haze. I made a few phone calls to my insurance company, to the university, to tell them I wouldn't be in. The voices on the other end of the line were distant, unreal. I moved through the motions of dealing with the disaster, but my mind was trapped in a feedback loop of regret and self-recrimination. Hours passed. The gray morning bled into a gray afternoon. The silence in my apartment was absolute. No construction sounds from across the street. No Julian. I told myself it was for the best. A clean break. I would have my apartment repaired. I would restore my routine. I would rebuild my fortress, stronger this time with higher walls. I would forget the feel of his hands, the taste of his kiss. I would go back to being the man in the window, the invisible observer. It was who I was, but the lie was thin and brittle. The solitude I was trying to reclaim was tainted now. It was no longer a peaceful state of being. It was a state of lack. It was defined not by its own quiet comfort, but by the glaring, painful absence of him. Late that evening, as darkness fell, I was sitting in my reading chair, staring at the blank, dark windows of his apartment across the street. I felt 1,000 years old. Then I heard it, a sound that did not belong. Footsteps. Heavy, familiar footsteps coming up the stairs of my own condemned building. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For a long moment, there was only silence. I held my breath. Then a soft, hesitant knock. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he would go away. Maybe I could pretend this wasn't happening. Lao. His voice, muffled through the wood of the door, but unmistakably his. It was quiet, uncertain. Leo, I know you're in there. I saw your light, my light. The one he used to watch from across the street. The irony was a bitter pill. I remained silent, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. Go away, I pleaded silently. Please, just go away and leave me with the pieces. Please, he said, and the word was cracked, broken. It was filled with a vulnerability that sliced through my anger and my shame. Please, open the door. I'm an idiot, slowly, as if moving through deep water. I stood up. I walked to the door, my heart a painful, heavy thud in my chest. I rested my forehead against the cool wood for a second, gathering myself. Then, I turned the lock and pulled the door open. He was standing there, looking wrecked. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes were the same ones he'd worn the day before. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been through his own personal storm. "I went to the site," he said, his voice low and hoarse. I thought if I just worked, if I just threw myself into it, my head would clear." He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. "It didn't work. I just kept seeing you. I kept replaying." He trailed off, unable to finish. I just stared at him, my arms crossed over my chest, a fragile shield. I wouldn't make this easy for him. "The note was clinical," I said, my voice flat and cold. He flinched as if I'd struck him. "I know. God, I know." I panicked, "Leo. I woke up this morning, and you were there, sleeping in my bed, and it was the most right thing I have ever felt in my entire life." And it terrified me. My shield wavered. The raw honesty in his voice was impossible to ignore. "I don't do this," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "I build things. I manage crews. I don't do feelings. I don't know how." My first instinct when something feels good, really good, is to run away from it before I can break it. He looked down at his own hands, then back up at me, his eyes pleading. Leaving that stupid note and running to work was the dumbest, most cowardly thing I've ever done. I spent the whole day feeling like I'd lost something I hadn't even realized I'd found yet. He took a tentative step closer into my doorway. "I'm not good with words," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you." The ice around my heart began to crack. His fear wasn't a rejection of me. It was a reflection of me. He was just as scared as I was. We were both standing on the edge of a terrifying new emotional territory, and he had blinked. But he had come back. "I thought you regretted it," I said, the words barely audible. "Regret it?" He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Leo, it was the only real thing that's happened to me in years. How could I regret that?" He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it out to me in his palm. It was a key. A single, shiny, newly cut key. "I went to the hardware store this afternoon," he said, "instead of working. I just stood there for an hour, trying to decide if I had the right." I looked from the key to his face. "It's for my place," he said softly. "It's not finished. It's a mess. But it's dry. And it's not empty anymore." He swallowed hard. "Not if you're in it. You don't have to use it. You can throw it away. But I want you to have it. Just in case." Or, not just in case, a symbolic gesture. An act of commitment so tangible, so real, it took my breath away. He wasn't offering me a night on his couch. He was offering me a space in his life. A key to the front door. Tears I hadn't realized I was holding back welled in my eyes. I reached out a trembling hand and took the key from his palm. It was cold from the night air, heavy and solid. "Real. I'm scared," I admitted, my voice thick. "Me too," he breathed, a universe of relief in his eyes. "We can be scared together." And in the doorway of my ruined apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a world washed away, he reached for me. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into his arms, burying my face in his shoulder, and held on like a drowning man who had finally found the shore. The key was clutched tight in my fist, a promise of a new foundation. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. My apartment was slowly being put back together by a team of restoration experts, but I spent very little time there. I lived across the street now, in a loft that was gradually becoming a home. Our home. The plywood floors were covered with warm, dark hardwood. The walls were painted a soft gray. My books and maps found a place of honor on shelves that Julian built for me with his own hands, his joinery meticulous and perfect. This morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw him standing by the massive window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the city as it woke up. The early morning light caught the silver in his hair. He was wearing a pair of my sweatpants and an old t-shirt. He turned, sensing I was awake, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. A smile I had never seen from my window, a smile that was just for me. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart filled with a calm, quiet joy that was still so new, so miraculous. He walked over and handed me a mug, then sat on the edge of the bed. We sat in a comfortable silence, sipping our coffee, watching the sun rise. This was our routine now, A new routine built not as a fortress against the world, but as a shared space within it. I used to think my life was a carefully curated collection, a finished archive of a quiet existence. I was wrong. My life was an unfinished book, and Julian was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the flood and the storm that wrecked my old world, but he was also the builder who helped me create a new one. He didn't just fix my apartment, he rebuilt me. He disrupted everything, and in doing so, he put everything right. He was the man I watched from my window, the stranger from across the street. Now, he was the man who handed me coffee in the morning, the man whose key felt heavy and permanent in my pocket. He was the solid, real thing in a life I no longer needed to hide from. He was home. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us build walls to keep ourselves safe, never realizing that the one person who can make us whole is standing just on the other side? Have you ever had a disruption in your life that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed our journey, please consider subscribing for more stories about finding love in the most unexpected places.